Moving on to the 12-mark question. With reference to extract B, discuss the use of quantitative easing in preventing deflation. Now, on first glance, that sounds like a really good question. It will allow you to really demonstrate that knowledge you have on quantitative easing, and backed up by an extract as well. Sounds like a really good 12-mark question there. So let's have a quick scan through extract B to see if there's anything with regards to quantitative easing preventing deflation. Okay, so extract B is quite large, so we'll have a quick scan through this. So first mention here, it voted to reduce base interest rate to 0.1% and restart the quantitative easing program by buying 200 billion of UK government bonds. So that's of course something we're going to use. And then a really good mention one line later is the deep recession. Of course, this is the downturn of the economic cycle if you think about the business cycle, and of course during a recession there's very low employment, there's very low levels of economic growth, and we can get deflationary pressures in a recession. Thus why UK economies and UK government and governments in general pursue expansionary policies during recessions to try limit the effects of deflation, and of course reducing interest rate is a great example of expansionary monetary policy. And this is another great point here. So of course during COVID we had a massive decrease in real GDP. What does real GDP mean? The amount of goods and services being produced in the economy. And this point mentions the Bank of England decided it was a good time to print lots of money. That was a mistake, as we had too much money being printed, but we didn't have enough goods. We were chasing too few goods. So that could act as a really good evaluation point for this paragraph. And again, two other great evaluation points here. So experts have argued this had pushed inflation to a higher level in the UK by stimulating aggregate demand. So if your paragraph, when you're evaluating the effectiveness, the positive effects of QE, you can say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the negative effects. Yes, we solved deflation, but we just got the opposite side of the spectrum. As we want to avoid deflation, of course, the UK's economic target is between 1 and 3%. We don't want deflation, but of course we do not want higher than 3% inflation rates. So yeah, we didn't get deflation, but we ended up massively high levels of inflation. So you can definitely evaluate the effectiveness, the positive overall effects of quantitative easing. But then later on in this paragraph, it says, however, critics say QE does not cause inflation, as most of the extra money is contained within the financial system. So maybe if you're writing a paragraph on the negatives of QE, you can use this evaluation point also. Let's get started with this first paragraph. Now, QE is a widely understood topic, but not understood well. A lot of students don't actually understand the process behind QE. They kind of know what QE is, but if you were to, and especially in a question like this, to pick up the higher level marks, you really need to understand the process behind QE, as it allows you to connect to the chains of analysis. So let's get started. The first thing, quantitative easing. What is it? Most economic students know what quantitative easing is. It's where new money is created. But now this is where the specific detail matters. It's where the Bank of England electronically creates new money, and the extract actually references this. And what does the Bank of England do with this money? It uses this to buy government bonds and sometimes corporate bonds. And as you can see in the extract, it mentions this here, quantitative easing program by buying 200 billion worth of government bonds and corporate bonds. Of course, 100% going to quote that. Now, quantitative easing has a big link to bonds. Now, bonds is a very hit and miss topic for students. A lot of students do neglect it, but for your chain of analysis, to be able to explain everything step by step, you need to understand the process behind bonds. So, if the UK government, if the Bank of England spends 200 billion on buying government and corporate bonds, how is it going to affect the bonds? So the price of the bonds, how is it going to affect it? And the yield of the bond. So how is it going to affect the price and the yield of the bond? Of course, if you're clued up on your yield analysis, you will know that the price of the bonds will increase due to increased demand for the bonds, but the yield, the interest rate on the bonds, will decrease. Now, by the Bank of England buying these corporate bonds, this increases the liquidity within the banking sector, within the financial sector. Why? Since essentially they've pumped 200 billion worth of new money into the financial sector. Now, if you pump 200 billion worth of new money into the financial sector, what effect is that going to have on the banking sector? It's going to mean the banks have more reserves of money. Therefore, they have more liquidity. And when banks have more liquidity, they're more likely to lend out, since they have more reserves, essentially. And if they're more likely to lend out, they'll give out more mortgages, maybe mortgages to riskier individuals. They'll give out more loans. And of course, you can understand the chain of analysis from there. It means there's going to be increase in income. You can say an increase in consumption. AD/AS analysis, of course, shifting out AD, consumption is 60% of AD, thus causing an increase in real GDP, an increase in price level Y, since we have demand pull inflation, since AD is shifting out, and of course, relating this back to the question, this demand pull inflation is, of course, the opposite of deflation, therefore it would help prevent that deflation. Now, of course, if banks are giving out loans more easily, if they're giving out more mortgages, it means households have more money to work with, they have more spending power, thus is going to lead to an increase in consumption, and even for firms, you can say interest rates effectively fall as well. As when the bond yield falls, we say the interest rate on bonds falls, and household interest rates usually follow, so therefore you can say firms invest more, so essentially we have an increase in investment by firms, an increase in consumption by firms. Of course, what does that lead to? What does that affect? They're both components of AD, causing AD to shift out to AD1, which of course is going to lead to the main thing, which is demand pull inflation, which is the opposite of deflation, which means we are 100% preventing deflation, and quantitative easing is an effective method to prevent deflation. And that's pretty much how I would write it. The main bit is understanding the process of quantitative easing. Towards the end, when you're talking about the ASAD analysis, you can talk about many different things like increase in marginal propensity to consume, increase in disposable incomes, lots of different ways you can navigate that end chain analysis, even talk about mortgages and mortgage repayment costs. But yeah, so that is the main chain analysis, and that is essentially how to smash out that KA part of that paragraph. Moving on to the evaluation stage of the paragraph. Now the first evaluation point, I'm just taking it straight from the extract. So of course, there was this point where there was too much money chasing too few goods. Then it pushed inflation higher in the UK by stimulating aggregate demand. I'm going to use those 2 points in my evaluation. Now, the way I'm going to evaluate it is talking about, however, this depends on the quantity of quantitative easing. Since, of course, in the end, the UK used around 895 billion worth of quantitative easing. And as you can see, by these 2 points, I'm going to use these both in my evaluation point, quote them directly. We created too much money when we were chasing too few goods. It led to stimulating aggregate demand. Essentially, yes, the economy was in a recession. We had a massive deflation risk, but the government just used way too much quantitative easing, leading to, as we know, a few months later, we saw 8 months of consecutive double-digit inflation, with massive inflationary pressures and massive inflationary risks. So, yes, we were safe from deflation, we were safe from one negative, but then we went to another massive negative of really high inflation. So it depends on the quantity of quantitative easing used, or you can say it depends on the unintended effects of quantitative easing. Now, with regards to the second evaluation point, I am going to be using one, you could probably call it my favourite diagram, which is, of course, we have time on the x-axis, we have real GDP on the y-axis, and of course it is the business cycle diagram. Why? Since, of course, we pursue quantitative easing during a recession, and during recessions we use expansionary policies like expansionary monetary policy, which is quantitative easing, and interest rates. But what is the problem with the recession, the downturn of the economic cycle? During this time, if we're thinking about consumer confidence is very low. Therefore, if consumer confidence is very low, how could that maybe limit our chain of analysis? The major limitation of low consumer confidence is this, and low consumer confidence, low investor confidence, is it could limit the degree to which we get an increase in consumption and an increase in investment. Why? If consumers are unsure about the economic outlook, the future of the economy, they're very likely to maintain a high savings ratio, meaning that they're not, even if there's lots of money pumped into the economy, even though it's very easy to take out a loan, due to the uncertain economic climate, they're unlikely to significantly increase their consumption and their investment. Therefore, it limits the degree to which AD shifts out, therefore limits the degree to which we actually get any demand pull inflation, or we could actually get no demand pull inflation. We could still be getting negative economic growth and negative deflationary pressures. Therefore, it's a really good evaluation point. So we're with that evaluation point. However, in evaluation, this depends on how the stage of the business cycle, which of course we were at a recession, affects consumer confidence. And if you're able to write that, able to back it up with a diagram, label it up on the diagram, then explain that chain of analysis, explain exactly how it's limited your chain of analysis, it's just an absolute A-star evaluation point, and you'll be smashing it. Another great evaluation point, which is actually very topical to the UK economy, is quantitative easing with regards to other government objectives. So yes, quantitative easing will help support the UK's government objective of maintaining stable inflation between 1% and 3%. But then we think about other government objectives, such as inequality. Quantitative easing is extremely bad, and it will worsen inequality to a massive degree. Why is that? Quantitative easing essentially reduces bond yields, it reduces the interest rates on bonds, so investors will look to invest into more lucrative assets. Another more lucrative asset is assets. So like houses, this will lead to a massive increase, a massive surge in house prices and a massive increase in demand for houses, which of course, if you think about a supply and demand diagram, is going to lead to an increase in the price for houses. Now let's think about which shareholders, which economic backgrounds in the economy hold most of the assets. Of course, the low income individuals usually don't actually even own a house, they rent houses, whilst high income individuals, they have portfolios of like hundreds of houses. Therefore, by pursuing quantitative easing, it's going to lead to an increase in asset prices, and this increase in asset prices boosts the wealth. It's a positive wealth effect for the individuals who have massive portfolios, who have massive assets, which again just increases that gap between the highest and the lowest income earners, the highest and lowest income backgrounds in society. And you can say it even makes it worse, since an increase in house prices therefore pushes up rental prices, pushes up prices to rent. Therefore, the low income earners in society now are forced with higher rents. Therefore, they have to pay higher rents, whilst the richer just get much richer. Therefore, again, increasing that gap between the high and the lowest income earners. And this is a major problem for the UK economy, especially post-COVID, post 895 billion worth of quantitative easing. It led to a massive increase in inequality within the UK. Now, especially if you're studying economics at university, or you just have a massive interest for economics, or just for general real-world application, there's a great YouTube channel which explains this inequality in really good depth and how it's affecting your daily lives. He's called Gary's Economics. You might have heard of him. I'll leave a link in the description to a really good video. It's not needed for your A-level economics. I would class it at this stage as entertainment, but it gives you a really good depth of understanding on the real world of UK economics. Now that is the 12-mark question done.